All right, folks,
Buckle up.
because you're in for a thrill ride, but unfortunately it's about real estate terms that you just really need to know. So some of this stuff is a little bit dry as far as the material goes. So get your coffee, get your Red Bull, handful of speed, whatever it takes, but we're gonna get this thing going. But seriously, if you're thinking about buying or selling a home, there are certain terms that you're definitely gonna wanna know and certain deadlines that you wanna make sure that you are hitting as well. In the description, I do have questions to ask for buyer's agents and for listing agents as you're interviewing them to make sure that they know exactly what they're talking about for these questions and they can give you really good answers. First things first, the price. And I know you'd be like, Sean, duh, I know what the price is. I said the price. But really just making sure, which is kind of crazy, but you want to make sure that what you told your realtor is the number that comes up on the purchase price for the contract. Super important, just take a look at it. But really what's also important about the price is what's tied to the price. And that's gonna be your earnest money deposit and your down payment. So your earnest money deposit, or some people call it EMD, or some people call it escrow because it's in an escrowed account, is actually just a set of money that's saying, hey, this buyer is serious about buying this house and they're gonna put this money up front and typically within the first 3 days of the contract. You wanna make sure that this is the right size deposit, especially if you're a seller. If you're a seller, you wanna make sure that they're putting up some skin in the game. You wanna make sure like, hey, we're not gonna give you $500 if we leave this. I typically say it's gotta be at least 1% of the purchase price. Now, I also prepare my buyers for the same thing to make sure that they have that kind of cash to bring to the table because that's really what it's gonna take most of the time in East Orlando. Might be different in your area, but that's how it is here. And again, as a seller, this is really important because if things do go wrong and the buyer backs out and they're not covered by their contingency, then that escrow is gonna be at risk of being yours, really, and you're gonna be covered for your liquidated damages. I have had people in the past where it was not that competitive a market and it was basically a buyer's market. They came in with a low EMD, so in other words, a couple $1,000s, and they had a longer closing, and sure enough, they backed out. Now, in the meantime, my seller moved out of their house, had to get everything else moved back into the house. It was such an ordeal, and you'd hate to have that happen no matter what, but you reduce those chances when you do have a higher EMD. The other factor that we were talking about with price is the down payment. How much are they putting down? Now, if you're FHA or even VA, you don't even have to put anything down. FHA, the minimum is 3.5% for your first-time home buyer. So that's what they have as far as cash allotted to them. But it's super important to actually check and be like, hey, what's gonna actually happen if this thing does come in low? Are they gonna be able to afford the repairs that might need to be done in the house? All of these things are really good questions to ask. That's what your listing agent should be asking the buyer's agent. And really, as we're talking about professionals, and this is a pro tip, I would make sure that on that pre-approval or proof of funds, that your realtor is actually reaching out to the lender. It is super important to make sure that one, this person knows what they're doing, knows what they're talking about, and has actually vetted their client. And then two, that they actually pick up the phone. Both of these are super important. The first one, they want to answer these questions. They should want to know, has it been run through the automated underwriting system, the AUS? Do you have all the documents and all the financial statements that are needed to close this thing out? And lastly, do they have the liquid funds to make sure that they can handle the appraisal, the closing costs, the down payment, and everything that's involved in buying a house? Next up is really the length of this agreement. How long does it last? Is it 30 days? Is it 15 days? Is it 5 months? Like, what is actually going on here? Now, in the state of Florida, it can be very different than, let's say, New York, where I'm originally from. That they're really just saying like, we'll close when we feel like closing.
I just want to tell you both good luck.
Sounds very New York, and it's pretty true. Florida's a lot more streamlined in that they can do 30 days, they can do 15 days. It's really determined upon the financing. If it's a cash deal, 15 days is easily done. If it's a financing deal, 30 days is easily done, and a lot of people can do less than 30 days. But there are also other things to consider when we're talking about closing. One, you can't close on a weekend or a holiday. So if your closing date, because you're tight on schedule and you're like, well, I gotta get it in on that Sunday, it's just not gonna happen. Nobody's working on the weekends. Well, I'm working on the weekends. I work every weekend, but you're not gonna be able to fund your house until the banks are open. So you're kind of stuck there. And that goes for the EMD and the inspection as well. So just make sure that if these deadlines land on a weekend, it's really not until the next business day. If you have a contract on Saturday, EMD is 3 days. We're talking Saturday is day 0, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. It has to be in by Tuesday. You lose that Sunday because it is a weekend day, but it doesn't end on a weekend, so that's why it still counts. So the same thing goes for inspections. If it ends on a weekend, it's gonna be the next business day. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't start on the weekend. Just like in my example, you started on the weekend, you started on Saturday, but that's day 0, and then you count out from there. Now, the star of the show, contingencies. These are like the fine print that nobody reads, but it's super important to understand. There are a whole lot of contingencies, but in the state of Florida, really the main 3 are the ones that you need to worry about on almost every deal, depending on if it's cash or not, is gonna be the inspection, the appraisal, and the loan approval. So the inspection contingency is really a period of time that the buyer will have an opportunity to go look at the house, make sure there's no huge holes in the ceiling, to make sure that the buyer really feels comfortable in that they can have at least a brief general inspection of the house. Now, typically here in Central Florida, you need a 4-point inspection. So that's gonna be your electrical, plumbing, roof, and AC. They're gonna make sure that you do that, and that's really because of insurance purposes. There are very few insurance companies actually left willing to do business in Florida, and they're getting more and more strict as the time goes on. After the inspection deadline, now comes the appraisal. So the bank is gonna make sure that they're doing a sound investment in giving you a mortgage to this house or giving the buyer a mortgage to the house. So they're gonna hire out a third party to give their subjective appraised value. It's really just their opinion of value to say like, hey, this house is worth it. Hey, it's not. Now, if it's under what your actual purchase price is, then you're gonna have to do some negotiation, or maybe they'll back out. That's the contingency coverage. Now, if it's over or at price, don't worry about it. You got some instant equity, congratulations, moving on. Last one is gonna be loan approval. So loan approval is making sure that you actually are approved for the loan on that specific house. A pre-approval is really just saying like, yeah, I checked your documents, I got everything together, I get it. Like, you look like you'll be approved for this number and all that stuff. But when you talk about taxes, when you talk about HOA, when you talk about all those things that are thrown in there, if you were on the border, sometimes that can make a difference. So you wanna make sure as far as being on top of that deadline as well. Really, to make these things easier in your mind, you could say if and only if. So the buyer will buy the house if and only if passes the deadline to the inspection period. The buyer will buy this house if and only if they pass the deadline for the appraisal. So it's a little bit easier to think about. The long and short of each of these contingencies or if and only ifs have a specific deadline that you really want to make sure that you're on top of, because it can make the difference in you possibly getting that escrow and you not getting that escrow. Now, that's not to say that if it passes the deadline, they're definitely going to give up that escrow. It actually has to be agreed upon by both parties. So sometimes it can get a little messy, but typically when somebody's breaching the contract, a lot of times they're gonna be giving up their escrow. Back to the fun stuff. All right, we're talking about seller credits. So seller credits are really the fact that your buyers, whoever the buyers are, they're saying, well, we need certain things done, or we need to do things on our own that are gonna need to be covered with some kind of payment from you. Now, that payment from you could be knocking off the top of the price, or it could be done in a seller credit. So it could be knocked off the price, or it can be involved in your closing costs or the buyer's closing costs and give them a little bit of a cushion there. Here in Orlando, a lot of seller credits go towards HVAC clean out, maybe some wood rot, taking care of that. The type of things that wouldn't prevent the house from closing, but it is something that's gonna have to be remedied before it gets worse. And the new homeowners are gonna be the ones taking over that problem, but you're giving them the cash to do so. I know it may seem like a lot, but this stuff is super important when you're buying and selling a house. So you wanna make sure to pay attention to the details, make sure to ask the right questions, and for the love of everything holy, please make sure that you know the deadlines. Don't forget to click on the handouts that I have in the description and take a look at my other videos. Thanks a lot for joining me.